recorded. And the second is to let you know that there is interpretation to 6 languages, which is available by selecting the button at the top of your screen. It should say Audio Channel Selector. And from there, you can choose whichever of the available languages you would like to listen to this presentation in. So with that being said, let's go ahead and kick things off. Again, my name is Ethan Earle. Welcome to today's panel, the first of 2 panels that we'll be having. And let me, without further ado, introduce Martin Schurdevan, who is the co-president of the left in the European Parliament. I heard that he was getting vaccinated perhaps this morning, so thanks for joining us right after that, Martin. It has been a long time, but I am happy to see you here today and to have you with us to welcome and introduce this important event. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Martin? There seems to be a little bit of a technical hiccup with Martin right now. I'm not sure if anybody can contact him. We'll wait just a minute or so to see if Martin can sort out his technical problem. And if not, I'll give my introduction and then we'll turn back to Martin right after it. There we go. There he is. Martin, if you're able, if you're ready, the floor is yours. I'm not actually sure what's going on right now, so I would ask our tech folks perhaps to check in with Martin and anybody else. I seem to see in his background that he is in the European Parliament right now. There should be good Wi-Fi and connectivity there. Perhaps somebody can run over or loan him a computer or whatever the case may be. We'll hold on here for just 1 or so more minutes. Thanks everybody for bearing with us. For me, this is my first time using the Interactio system, and I felt very lucky not to have any tech problems, but presumed that there might be a few little ones. So we'll wait for just another minute and see if we can get Martin with us. And if not, I'll go ahead and give my own introduction and then see if during that time we're able to sort out Martin's tech problems. Okay, I still don't see Martin lighting up in the way that I understand he should light up. So I'll just ask Olivier and the others to perhaps check in with him and anybody else who can contact him. And we're just going to flip-flop our 2 introductions. Martin was going to give a welcome and then I was going to introduce the panel. I will just start introducing the panel. And then hopefully we'll have Martin pop in for a word of welcome to all of us after that. So as all of you know, this event is about US-EU relations. The prompt in some ways is that we are 100 days into the Biden-Harris administration, actually a little bit more than 100 days. And it has been an incredibly action-packed period of time, as all of you know. You will certainly have heard about the calls for multilateral re-engagement. You will have heard about his return to the Paris Agreement. You will have heard about the
zurückgekommen. Sie haben
diplomatic talks with Iran, about the decision to go forward with a military withdrawal from Afghanistan, a hardening of US policy relating to military assistance to Saudi Arabia and its ongoing proxy war in Yemen. And you'll have heard about the enormous and comparatively universalist stimulus package, as well as the calls to raise corporate taxes, not just in the US, but across the world. You will also have heard about the Biden administration's support for a vaccine patent waiver to combat the coronavirus. You will likewise have heard about the decision to keep the US Embassy in Jerusalem, about the reticence of the Biden administration in weighing in on brazen and thoroughly illegal attacks against the people of Gaza, which itself is undergirded by deep US complicity. You'll have heard about ongoing support for Saudi Arabia. You'll have heard about Biden offhandedly calling Putin a murderer, about his ongoing tendency to equate left-wing populism in Latin America with right-wing ethno-nationalism rising across the globe. And you'll have heard the dark ruminations of his administration regarding a century-defining conflict with China, which is framed as one in which there can only be one winner. You'll have also heard about the growing stockpile of vaccines sitting in US storage rooms while people continue to die in record numbers from a virus that continues to wreak havoc across the globe. There has indeed been a lot of debate over these last days and weeks and months about the nature of this Biden-Harris administration. Is it reinventing social democracy beyond neoliberalism? Or is it just new clothes for the old ceremony? In a recent article in the New Left Review, Cédric Dudon stated that this flurry of activity, and particularly the Biden administration's shift in economic policy at home and abroad, marks the moment that global capitalism begins to reorganize beyond neoliberalism, but not as a radical project, but rather as a reactive one that seeks to reckon with the now manifest failures of neoliberalism, with the inability of the neoliberal toolkit to combat crises, ranging from the climate crisis to uprisings in the streets, and with its very inability to manage even the day-to-day aspects of capital accumulation in the current world historic phase. For Duran, this is a necessary project of the political and economic elite to re-legitimize a social order that is failing at a global level. I would thus interpret his answer to the current debate that it might be both: the reinvention of social democracy beyond neoliberalism to provide necessary new clothes for an old ceremony of exploitation and elite minority rule. Whatever your initial thinking is, all of you who are with us today, I think that we can all agree that it is absolutely crucial for us to look at Biden's foreign policy, which is what we are going to be doing here, both for the straightforward reason that US foreign policy is consequential for the world and too often for the worse, and also since, as we know too well, an otherwise progressive turn in domestic policy can easily be undergirded by reactionary policies abroad, the externalizing and outsourcing and offshoring of exploitation and suffering. I hope that our speakers, as well as each of you, will have this in mind as we trace out the contours of the Biden-Harris foreign policy to this point, the purposes and rationale behind it. What of it is hard and consequential as a rock, and what of it is ephemeral, little more than words that will evaporate in the next round of record-breaking heat waves that we are sure to suffer this summer. So, leaving things there for just a moment, pausing, I would like to see if we now have Martin, who could join us, the co-president of the Left Caucus in the European Parliament, to add on to what I've said, to contribute his words of welcome for this event. Martin, are you there?
Yeah, hello. This is Martin speaking. Can you hear me finally?
Yes, we hear you just fine. We can't see you, but we hear you. You are crystal clear.
That's great. Unfortunately, I have some technical problems with all my devices, and I'm not sure if I can switch the camera on because then I'm afraid I will lose connection again. I try.
Okay.
Give me a sec. All right, you should see me now.
We see
Yes.
you and we hear you. I'm really
Yes,
happy
that's
to
great.
both see you and hear you,
I'm
Martin.
sorry. I'm sorry for the delay. It was really due to technical problems, and I will keep it brief. But let me welcome you first on behalf of the Left Group in the European Parliament for this very important initiative, and I'm very glad to have all of you with us today and to hold this exchange of views on the international challenges that we are facing as progressives on both sides of the Atlantic in the European Union and also in the United States. Please allow me to already convey at this early stage of the webinar a special thank you to Stelios Kouloglou, whose initial idea it was to have this exchange of views or to build those bridges that we are today working on. And I think it is more needed actually than ever nowadays to build on these bridges, or to build these bridges, to work on these bridges, because we as progressives have to deal with multifold challenges. And let me briefly touch upon some of those before I would like to give the floor, of course, to the people, Ethan, that you already introduced, and to give you the chance to discuss the topics of the first seminar. So I think that we are facing altogether a crisis of democracy in both the US and in the European Union. Some of the member states here clearly have problems, or we see problems where the freedom of press is attacked, where the independence of the juridical system is questioned, where the equality of men and women is also put under pressure. And we saw on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean the former, and I have to say, luckily so, the former Trump administration with its non-acceptance of the democratic vote and the democratic process, with its alignment with the far right and white supremacist groups, leading also to racist policies, and his alignment with climate change deniers, etc., etc. And what we really can state here, I think, and maybe this can also be a starting point for our common discussion, is that democracy needs to be restored on both sides, and that trust needs to be restored, and that also trust needs to be developed between progressives in the US and progressives in the European Union. A second challenge that we are all facing is, of course, the pandemic. And that pandemic has revealed all the weaknesses of a neoliberal structured society. I'm not referring only to the economy. I'm really referring to all the sectors of society. All of them have been subject to financialization and privatization. And we can clearly see this, especially in public services, especially in the health systems all over the world, so to say, well, clearly here in the European Union. And what we need is a major change in politics, leaving behind for good the policies of austerity and the policies of neoliberalism. And I actually see with great interest what is going on now in the political debate in the United States, and maybe you can elaborate on that later today in the webinar. And I also want to encourage those who are pushing for that change, entering into a phase of massive, huge investments in public services and public infrastructure, but also investments in the future of society, tackling climate change on the one hand and trying to master the digital change or the digital transition, which will have a huge impact on the workforce and also on all sectors of society. And I have to say that I see this with such great interest, because in the European Union, we do not have, for now at least, the majoritarian, is that the word, but you understand what I want to say, the majoritarian political will to change this policies of austerity, or to leave it behind for good, and also of neoliberalism. So we are demanding it as progressives, but still there is no majority for that in the European Union. Maybe the Biden administration has something else in mind. And maybe the progressives in the US can also put some more pressure on the Biden administration in order to actually fulfill this change, this major change in politics that is so urgently needed. And the third challenge I'd like to touch upon is, of course, that increasingly unstable and insecure international political environment that we are dealing with and that we are all facing. The US is challenged in its hegemony by China. There are talks of again increasing the transatlantic collaboration between the European Union and the US. In my position, maybe you differ there, or some of you might differ there. I think that the European Union and Europe needs to define its own political role in international politics and world politics with regards to China, with regards to Russia, but also with regards to the US. But nevertheless, we as progressives, we have to collaborate closely. And having said all this, I think that one of the consequences for a peaceful development would be the strengthening of multilateralism. And you will discuss international trade matters. You will also discuss the role of multilateral institutions like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization. Two latter played a major role also in fighting the pandemic. We also need a common approach in tackling climate change. And in the US, I know the progressives have been putting forward that idea of a new green deal. Some of us here in Europe talk about a progressive new deal, but regardless the title, it is an international task and we have to collaborate closely there together. And I'm sure that we will also touch upon this topic today in this webinar. And we also need to work together on a common idea how the future digitalized society and the world of labor will look like. And this is something that we really need to elaborate on, where we need to provide answers for those who are, let's say, working in that Manchester capitalism style, like new digitalized work of labor nowadays or today. And also we need to collaborate closely to build a world, and I'm not overestimating here or exaggerating. I'm sorry, I'm not exaggerating here. We also need to work together on a world peace order, and I'm convinced that we need to do this. Despite all the hegemonic battle that the US is facing and those middle powers wielding their influence in order to protect their interests. But we need to give answers to a peaceful development. And last but not least, democracy is in danger. I started with that, but in my opinion, it is my deepest conviction, it can be strengthened by social or with social justice. And those who really want to protect democracy and democracies need to have the courage to challenge the political and the economic power of multinational companies, of super rich people. Wealth needs to be redistributed in our societies on this side and on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So thank you again for being with us, for hosting this very important webinar together with the left group in the European Parliament. Ethan already introduced the speakers of the first panel, so I just wish you and also, of course, the speakers of the second panel good proceedings today. And I have to run off now because I'm going to get vaccinated right now. So please enjoy this webinar, and I'm looking forward to the future collaboration between progressive forces in the European Union and progressive forces in the United States. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin. It's really good to have you. Again, for anybody who is just joining, Martin Schurdevan is the co-president of the left group in the European Parliament. And he will be joined in this first panel today with two other members of European Parliament, as well as with three foremost experts from the United States on different areas of foreign policy. So that was, it was fantastic to hear from Martin. I'm glad that he was able to squeeze in time between the tech problems and getting vaccinated. I wish him the best of luck. Glad to hear that he's getting vaccinated. I think that Martin is completely right in locating this crisis of democracy as one which is shared between the United States, the European Union, and indeed other corners of the world. We seem to be in a crisis of liberal democracy and in something of an interregnum of sorts, where the old is dying or has died in many ways, and the new, what comes next, has yet to be born. I would also very much agree with and second what Martin said about this crisis of the pandemic, which is in many ways revealed and exacerbated the multiple crises that we have been living through for a long time now. And the old saying is that in crisis we find opportunity, or at least that is what the right says and acts upon. And so is there opportunity also for the left in this current crisis, perhaps by putting pressure on the Biden administration, by introducing radical reform to the European Union, by radically re-articulating the relationship with multilateral organizations, with intergovernmental organizations, in terms of the relationship between the US and China, in terms of the role of the EU in the multilateral order. All of these are very good and important questions which Martin has posed for us today. So now let's go ahead and get started. As I said, we're going to have, after Martin, 5 speakers, including 2 members of European Parliament, as well as 3 leading experts from the United States. I will introduce them one by one before their interventions. And just a final comment on sort of the form of this panel. First of all, for anybody who has arrived late, again, you can find interpretation at the top of the screen by selecting the audio channel selector. It's right up there. You can also, or rather should know, that we are recording this. And again, I welcome those of you who are here on Interactio with us today, as well as those who are joining us on other platforms. So now let's go ahead and get started. There's just this one little note on the program. You will see that we are listed to go for about the next 1.5 hours, 1 hour and 34 minutes. We will actually stop a little bit before that, at least 5 minutes, and perhaps a little bit more, to give those of you in attendance a break between the 2 panels. So we will stop at the very latest 25 after, not this coming hour, but the hour after that, which is 16:25 in Central European time, and you can do the math depending on where you are in the world. You'll also note that on the program we have a broad array of topics for discussion that have been listed today, which have been articulated already by Martin. And now I am about to give each of our speakers about 7 minutes to cover them. So this is a tall task. And the idea is not for us to say everything that needs to be said in the first round of interventions. To the contrary, we really wish to open up lines of debate between our speakers and also with you in the audience, encouraging each of our speakers to connect to each other and, to the extent possible, to break through the presentation format and have at least a little bit of a conversation. To further encourage that, after our first round of interventions, I'm going to open a second round just amongst our 5 speakers, where each of you will have the chance to build on or to respond to what the others have said, as well as to take on a few additional questions that I will toss into the mix. We'll then conclude today's session, as I mentioned, by bringing all of you from the audience into the debate with your questions and your insights. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to announce our excellent speakers one by one, as I said, just before they speak. And I am thus going to begin with our first speaker, Mark Weisbrot, who is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which has been around since 1999. It's a think tank that manages to be both enormously political in its interventions and also totally rigorous in its academic and intellectual production, which is not always an easy task, as many of you might know. Mark has been at the forefront of this balance for a long time. He's done lots of work in Europe and in Latin America, working on international finance institutions, on special drawing rights, doing critical work around US economic sanctions, and more broadly serving as one of our in the United States, most important voices understanding macroeconomic issues. So Mark might be speaking, amongst other issues, on Biden's macroeconomic approach, on sanctions, on IFIs, on Latin America, on Europe. We'll see sort of where the spirit takes him over the course of these next 7 minutes or so. So that being said, Mark, I give the floor to you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thanks, Ethan, and thanks for the great overview from both you and Martin. It helps me in particular to present a couple of issues which are not that easy to present in 7 minutes. But I think that I want to focus on it because I think this collaboration that you guys talked about is very important. You know, in the United States, for example, on foreign policy, the Congress has a role that most of the world doesn't know about. That is different from a lot of most other countries, and you know, it has more of a role. And so I think to the extent that we can collaborate, we can change certain things, and get your voice out there, especially from the European Parliament, from a part of the European Parliament that is not heard as much in the media. And this, I think, is really important because Europe too often plays a supportive role for some of the worst things that the U.S. government does, and it doesn't have to. For example, there's no rule that says that the United States has to run the International Monetary Fund, which it basically does, and on most of the world, they allow some input from Europe on matters. You know, for example, in the world recession of 2009, when Europe started borrowing from the IMF, then they were allowed some more input, but otherwise it really is decided. And I'll give you one example. It is decided by the United States Treasury Department. And one example was last year when the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, proposed an issuance of special drawing rights, which Ethan just mentioned, which is a reserve asset that is issued by the IMF. And this is a really important thing. It's not exactly like a currency, so it doesn't make the IMF into a central bank, but it allows the IMF to play a positive role, which it doesn't always play, by issuing this reserve asset to all countries without conditions, and it's not a loan, and it can make a big difference in a pandemic recession like we have just we are still in. Well, in some countries we're still in the recession as well, but and so it was a very important thing. And the Trump administration just vetoed it. I mean, they didn't even have to vote. They just said, you know, we're not going to support this, and that was the end of it. And for a year, at least. And so we got to work on it, and we got Congress to pass twice a law that said that the U.S. Treasury had to support. We got the House to pass that, and of course the Republicans blocked it in the Senate, but the U.S. had to support this issuance. Now, I won't go into the details of that, but this is an example of where you know, the United States controls these institutions, and it really shouldn't. I mean, Europe is the European Union is bigger by both economy and population than the United States. They should have a voice in these institutions, especially the IMF, which is the most important and powerful financial institution in the world. And so this is an important thing. Now, another place where I think Europe, and this is related to the Biden administration, because the Biden administration did change that. I mean, the Treasury, when Biden came in, Treasury supported pretty much the most it could support in terms of the special drawing rights. Without the approval of the U.S. Congress, because the Republicans continue to block it in the Senate. So that's a really important thing that will save a lot of lives in the world. There's no doubt about it. By preventing crises, by lowering borrowing costs, by all kinds of things that would not be possible without these funds. And again, it's not like normal IMF lending, which has conditions attached to it and is loans instead of just assets issued to these countries, which are convertible to hard currency. So that's a very important thing. And again, Europe can play a role in that going forward, a positive role, and it doesn't have to go along with whatever Treasury wants. Another place where I think Europe could play a really important role, and this again will determine to what extent the Biden administration changes policy, and that's Latin America, because there the United States has, of course, played a terrible role for the last, for the last more than a century and a half, but especially in the last 20 years, because you had left governments were elected. In fact, in the last decade, they governed the majority of the region, and the United States government intervened in almost all of the countries that elected left governments, including Brazil. It's now coming out, that the Department of Justice was involved in preventing Lula, getting him in jail and preventing Lula from running for president again, and the U.S. Department of Justice. And so, but it's so many countries. I mean, I could spend a whole hour describing what they did. And here you see European support. And this is bad because it helps legitimize what the Monroe Doctrine and what the United States is doing. Now, the question is, will Biden change any of this? So far, no. But it could change. And again, Europe could play a role. I'll give one example from last year, or from 2019, actually. There was a military coup in Bolivia that overthrew a democratically elected government. And no one disputes that the government was democratically elected in 2014 and still had remaining months in its term. And it was headed by President Evo Morales, the first indigenous president. And it was led by white supremacists who actually massacred indigenous people as they took power. And within a week after they took power, I should say. And this is a horrible thing. And they did it with help from the Trump administration, and particularly the Trump collaboration with the Organization of American States, which lied about the election quite openly. And this was demonstrated and set up the coup by pretending that the government had actually stolen the election, when this was completely false and shown to be false right away. You only need arithmetic actually to see it. Although there were a number of statistical studies as well, which we published, but it was very simple and it was a straight out lie. And they used it to overthrow this government. And the European Union supported that. They issued a statement on the day of the coup, in support of that coup. And so again, will Biden change anything on this? They haven't yet. But if you get more voices from Europe, and that is one difference from Biden and Trump, is that Biden does care to some degree what Europe thinks, and so that's a place where Europe can have a positive influence. I'll give one other example, and that is sanctions. Sanctions, and the sanctions that the United States implements unilaterally are really a crime, and a quite violent one. Jeffrey Sachs and I did a paper in 2019. It just looked at mortality. Did a number of things, looked at the sanctions and how they damage the economy and so on, but also the mortality statistics just from 2017 to 18, when the Trump administration broadened the sanctions. It killed, it went up by 40,000 people. And I would say by now, probably hundreds of thousands of people have been killed as a result of these sanctions. And this is very deliberate. This is collective punishment as defined by the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention. These would be war crimes if not for the technicality that there isn't an actual war taking place. And I think this is very important for people to make this point repeatedly, that something that is a crime, when people are shooting and bombing each other, it should be considered a crime. And the United Nations has made this point. It should be considered a crime when there is no technical war declared or technically going on. And just to show you how much this really is the purpose of it, you have statements from the U.S. administration. The Trump administration said very openly. This was Pompeo in 2019. He said the circle is tightening on Venezuela. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground there in Venezuela last night. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from. And he said this as and then he said something similar about Iran, which Human Rights Watch pointed out, that things are much worse for the Iranian people with the sanctions. And we are convinced that this will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime and basically overthrow it. And so this is really, these are real crimes. And the European Union should not be going along with this or supporting it. And on the positive side, the European Union did withdraw their support for the president, the so-called president that was chosen by the United States for Venezuela. And that's an important step, because that, of course, was part of the deadly sanctions. That is, once they chose another president, then all of the assets of the country and most of the income from overseas was cut off. And of course, Venezuela is dependent for oil on oil exports for 87% of its export earnings, and just the magnitude of what is it
1 minute, yeah.
The magnitude of the destruction there, the decline in GDP, real GDP from, and this is really a result of the sanctions. There's no economist that can argue otherwise. From 2015 to 2020, they lost 74% of their economy, and that's just unprecedented without like a massive war. So I want to say, just on the international financial institutions again, the World Trade Organization, and there's a place where the United States and Europe again took the same position, which blocked the efforts of the vast majority of the World Trade Organization to lift intellectual property restrictions on the production of vaccines. Now, Biden has reversed that after a lot of pressure for several months, but he hasn't really reversed the position. But it's going to take, at this point, quite a long time before more countries can produce vaccines in the world. So there's a lot more I could say here. In the remaining minute, I'll just say that it's very important for the European Union to develop on these and so many other issues a foreign policy that's independent of the United States. And I hope that we can collaborate to promote that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much, Mark. That was a very strong and political opening intervention. I believe that Mark, in his very first words, made an offer. I'm getting a lot of feedback here. I think I'm going to try to close. Yeah, there we go. That's better. In his very first words, Mark made an offer to help to make European voices heard in U.S. Congress and to raise up the voice that Europeans can have with a Biden administration that is more sensitive to this historic relationship between Europe and the United States. And he touched on reserve assets from the IMF as an underused power, on changing U.S. Historic relationship with Latin America, its history of interventionism, and this terrible, terrible issue of sanctions by which the United States is punishing and killing tens and hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Great. We're going to move forward quickly. I was a little bit lax with my 7 minutes there, as some of you might have seen, but it's good and important stuff. And I'm glad that Mark was driving us in very practically to ways that we can develop collaborations on both sides of the Atlantic. I know that there are a bunch of members of European Parliament who are in attendance today, and now we are going to hear from one of them, Marissa Matias from the Bloco de Esquerda in Portugal. Marissa is the left shadow rapporteur on the European Parliament's report on the future of EU-US relations. It's a very consequential document, and I'm really excited to hear what she has to say about it today, how it can inform our conversation, and how it can hint towards priority areas for progressive transatlantic cooperation during this next period. Marissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know if you are seeing me.
We can't see you. We hear you really well. You seem to have the Martin problem from before.
Okay, I'm going to connect the camera. I'm sorry. Okay, it's done already. I imagine that you can see me now. Okay, it's dark, but I'm here. Okay.
Hi.
So I'm in my office, so it's not so easy. But in any case, thank you so much. Thank you, Ethan. And I also want to thank Helmut for organizing this webinar. I think it's really, really important for us to discuss these issues. So I'm here to talk about the report that we are discussing at the European Parliament. And you know that every time that the US administration changes, the European Parliament takes time to try to debate the relations between the European Union and the US, and especially the future relations of the European Union and the US. Of course, taking as around the change in the administration. We don't have much power, but we have the capacity to recommend to the Vice President of the European Commission and responsible for European External Action Service to somehow frame the new relations with the US. And of course, this is a very sensitive issue when it comes to the European Parliament. And so I can give you in a I try to be as brief as possible, but I'll give you some ideas of the issues that we are discussing now. And so I've been working on this file with Nuno Pedrosa, who is also in the working group of the European Left for the United States. So you can talk with both of us on these issues. But basically, what we are trying to do as part of the left input to this report is that we want somehow to think how can we rebuild the relations with the US, and especially when it comes to the definition of it, how can we think about the transatlantic partnership by trying somehow to change the paradigm, to have a paradigm shift from the neoliberal policies and try to have somehow in this new context a progressive agenda focusing on people and works for a sustainable and environmental future. So we are working mainly in two dimensions, and as we know, that is really difficult, and especially because you know that over the last years, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament has a lot of engagement and involvement of Eastern countries, members of the Parliament, and this is also true for this report. So basically, with the negative past relations, I would say, with the Soviet Union and things like that, so that these are tendencies, I would say that there's this open window to new relations with the United States, and like, okay, what comes from the United States is good, so this is more or less the approach. Of course, we want to give political sense to these relationships, and as I said, shifting from neoliberal policies agreement like the trade agreements and things like that, and trying to put in the center of the discussion a progressive agenda is our key priority. So we have been presenting proposals basically devoted to the challenges that we have to face in the future. And it will be easier if we can do it together, like, for instance, the climate change. So climate change is really some of it has some of the areas where we are trying to introduce some modifications in this agreement in order to see how can we work for the future and how can we put the climate change in the center of the political agenda and see it is as a priority, because this is really for us as well a key priority. Also, we have a key element for us which has to do with the tax justice, and also the possibility of having a new relationship between the European Union and the US based on having coordinated measures to fight all sorts of policies that enable the corporations and multinationals and also countries, because we have countries in this situation, to have tax policies which have nothing to do with tax justice, and also we need to define, I think, as a common goal, cooperation to define minimum levels of taxes politics when it comes to multinationals and corporations. And of course, tax avoidance by global companies is a key element, both for policies in the EU and also in the United States. And again, we always come back to the same debates when it comes to NATO and defense. And so we really want to change what is at the core of the relations between the European Union and the United States to a future agenda devoted to climate change and tax justice. So we know that we don't have much capacity to change the policies around this, but we do have the capacity to make recommendations to the European Commission and to the High Representative when it comes to external action services. So this is very important for us. I just want to highlight what is our main areas of intervention, but this is very important for us to have the possibility and the capacity to discuss these in such type of discussions like this webinar, because we have a lot of work to do for the future. And there's huge pressure, but even that we don't have the capacity to define the new legislation, we have the capacity to interfere, and whatever it will be the decision at the end and the majority taken by the parliament, it will be very relevant, even that is a lot in terms of symbolic issues, but it's relevant. What is the definition? So I want to hear from you, and of course I just avoided a key issue because it will be taken in by the next speakers, which has to do with the relations with China and the role of China. So this, of course, will be at the center of the discussion, but as we have these discussions just in the next two interventions, then we can bring it to the debate. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Marissa. Again, Marissa is a member of European Parliament from Bloco de Esquerda in Portugal. She is the left caucus's shadow rapporteur on the European Parliament's report on the future of EU-US relations. It will be a very important document for guiding this relationship going forward from the European side. I think that we, in advance, heard some specific recommendations from Mark, who somehow perhaps anticipated where the conversation was heading. From Marissa, we heard, really about this possibility to introduce recommendations, emphasizing from the perspective of the European left, climate change recommendations, possibilities for collaboration and policy orientation, the issue of tax justice, and also the issue of reorienting away from an axis of relation which is based around NATO and defense and towards one that is based on a progressive agenda focusing on working people and our shared planet. So again, these are things that hopefully some of our next speakers will touch on, but that also I'd like for us to come back to this during the next round when we're having a conversation amongst all 5 of the speakers. So great, our next speaker coming right up, live from Lima, Peru, I believe, where she just arrived this morning ahead of the elections that are taking place there. And I'd like to hear her perhaps make a comment on that. We have Medea Benjamin, who is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink, which fights to end U.S. wars and militarism, support peace and human rights, and redirect U.S. tax dollars into life-affirming programs. And speaking of rigorous activists, we had one in Mark, and Medea certainly also matches that description. She has a deep, deep knowledge of war and peace issues that is matched only by her willingness to really put herself out there as an activist on the line for what's right. So Medea is going to be speaking, among other issues, on the positioning of the Biden administration in the recent Israel-Palestine conflict and broader Middle East policy, including Iran, and perhaps more broadly on war and peace issues. Medea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I hope you hear me okay. Yes, I'm in Peru, where we're hoping for a progressive win in the Sunday election, which will be so important for all of Latin America. When we talk about Biden's foreign policy, it's interesting the positive developments we've seen on the domestic front contrasted to a lot of the negative things on the international front. There are a few bright spots, as you said when you opened up, Ethan, like withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's also the extension of the START treaty with Russia, rejoining the Paris Accords, the World Health Organization. But for the most part, progressives have been disappointed in the foreign policy. And I want to start just by looking at the Biden's proposed budget, because it tells us so much about his priorities at a time when we need massive amounts of money to confront the pandemic, climate issues. We see a massive military budget that is even bigger than that of the Trump administration. No recognition that we should have a savings from ending the war in Afghanistan, or that it's time to cut back on the plus 800 military bases around the world. There's even a call in the budget for spending $43 billion on modernizing our nuclear weapons. The Biden administration has embraced militarism, including NATO, continues Trump's push to call on the European countries to increase their military expenditures. So one area where we could certainly work together is to denounce the U.S. call for, quote, modernizing its nuclear weapons, to call on all nuclear powers to not only fulfill their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but to join the new UN treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. And given the urgency of the economic crisis caused by the pandemic, we should jointly denounce NATO's call to spend 2% of our GDPs on the military, which has always been absurd, but is now even more so. Another area where we feel disappointed by Biden has been Iran. Trump pulling out of the nuclear deal has been disastrous. I must say that I was surprised and disappointed that the Europeans were unable to effectively counter Trump's sanctions against Iran. But given that the nuclear deal had been the signature foreign policy achievement of the Biden administration, many of us thought that when Biden came back in, this would be one of the first things on his agenda. Unfortunately, it took months before these serious talks began, and hopefully there will be a deal very soon, and we thank the Europeans for helping to move that along. But the slowness of the Biden administration has strengthened the hardliners in both the United States and Iran, as we will undoubtedly see in the upcoming Iran elections. We need the Europeans to play a strong mediating role vis-a-vis Iran. And I know there have been some calls among the European left that have been very concerned, and rightly so, about Iran's human rights concerns. but we need to continue to engage with Iran no matter who is in charge after the elections. Engagement is a good thing for human rights. One area where engagement is actually not a good thing is in the sale of weapons to human rights violators such as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, and Egypt. We thought the Biden administration, which had been very critical of Saudi Arabia during his campaign, would stop the support for the war in Yemen. And while he did put a hold initially on sales of weapons to the Saudis and the Emirates, that hold has been lifted. The administration recently gave a green light for an enormous $23 billion weapons sales to the Emirates, is resuming, quote, defensive weapon sales to the Saudis. And U.S. companies, we have found out, are still authorized to maintain Saudi warplanes, which means our government is still enabling the Saudi offensive operations in Yemen and is enforcing the inhumane blockade of Yemen's ports. This is something we should jointly denounce, not only the U.S. support, but also U.S. and European weapons companies in their sales to human rights abusers, which brings me to my final point, which is around the Israel-Palestine conflict. It has been very disappointing to hear from the Biden administration to Angela Merkel, leaders of the so-called free world give Israel another free pass with the pathetic slogan that Israel has the, quote, right to defend itself. The Biden administration is still enabling Israel's occupation of Palestine and the siege of Gaza by giving $3.8 billion of our tax dollars a year to Israel. But that hasn't been enough. Israel now wants to buy another $735 million in weapons. And as we speak, Israel Defense Minister is in the United States now asking for the United States to give it another $1 billion to replenish these supplies that it used up in its attack on Gaza. For the first time, however, we are seeing the unconditional support for Israel being opposed not only in the streets, but also in Congress, where popular leaders like Senator Bernie Sanders have been introducing legislation to stop these weapons sales. So it's heartening to see the left coming together to be more vocal and unified in a pro-Palestinian position. I know this is a very difficult issue in Europe, particularly in Germany, even among some sectors of the left, but we must insist that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and we must support the nonviolent campaign to boycott, sanction, and divest from Israel while we demand equal rights for the Palestinians. So thank you very much for this time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Medea. That was excellent. It was a very strong intervention, which was also a really very focused, right? We talked about some specific areas for potential collaboration here. Looking first at this just outrageous fact of what $43 billion that will be spent by the Biden administration to modernize its nuclear weapon arsenal. Right at the moment where internationally we see the UN treaty to abolish nuclear weapons taking a huge amount of steam. This is a hungry space for potential collaboration between US and European allies in the progressive sphere. And we've heard about sanctions both from from Mark and also now again from Medea. And in terms of what's happening in Iran, it's again Medea has voiced her disappointment that Europeans have not played a stronger mediating role, and I think very powerfully reminded us that engagement is a good thing when it comes to human rights, right? And then finally, and this sort of circles back in some ways to the nuclear weapon thing, again, a much more emphasis and focus on weapons sales to Israel, to various parts of the world where these weapons are being used to kill people. And it sounds very simple and straightforward, but alongside the United States, which is the world's #1 seller of conventional weaponry, We have the countries of Germany, we have France, both of which are in the top 5 and are selling huge amounts of weapons around the world right now. So it's bedrock of the European Union. We see undergirded in some way as well by weapons sales. So here is another space for very concrete collaboration. Great. Let's move right forward. Our next speaker is Helmut Schultz, a member of European Parliament again. You'll notice that we have kind of an interplay of sorts between our American speakers, our US-based speakers, and our members of European Parliament. Now we have Helmut, who is the left coordinator in the Committee on International Trade. I will also say I've worked with Helmut a lot, and he is a tireless and consummate politician who brings fights to the European Union when that's what's needed, and brings diplomacy as well when that's what's required. He is a man with an unwavering commitment both to left politics and systems change, and also to getting things done. And that's not always an easy balance to find. So Helmut has, amongst his many, many working areas, a long commitment to bringing US progressives and leftists to Europe for exchange and collaboration. And he will be speaking, among other things, on the EU-US-China relationship and what that means in terms of trade relations. Helmut, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for having the chance to be with you in this panel. Maybe I should use and switch to German so that we are using also the opportunity for the translation we have organized for this panel debate, so that also audience in other regions than in the Brussels bubble and maybe in the US can understand and follow this. So I want to switch to German, and I hope you agree with that. I can later on in the discussion probably come back to English. Wenn wir über das Dreieck der Beziehungen USA, EU und China sprechen wollen, und das ist einer der Topics,
the USA, and that is one. So when we talk about the 27 entities in the EU, as well as we can talk about disarmament and fight against armament and classic foreign policy, financial relationships.
Wir haben eben immer mit diesem Dreieck mit einer großen globalen Herausforderung zu tun. Und deshalb glaube ich,
this triangle, and that is a huge challenge for all of us. And that is why the progressive forces have to say that we have to get away from the concrete challenges that we have to face to the concrete tasks that we have to face in the EU, in the US. And these are much more important at the moment to look ahead and beyond our direct problems without giving up our values that we have in a specific region. And the central tasks that I see are tasks for humanity, which are overcoming poverty, halting the climate catastrophe, stopping the extinction of species, so species dying out, and the other sustainability goals jointly agreed in the United Nations by 2030 to at least fulfill them to the most part. And that is a huge program. And what worries me at the moment in European politics, and Marisa, when she talked about the report, has talked about the relationships between the EU and the US. And there is a second very important report from the Foreign Trade Commission that has prepared a report as well, which says that the cooperation between the EU, China, and the US, or EU and US and China, or between the US and EU and China. I say it on purpose in this specific way, has to be looked at in a very specific way. And that is something that we have to take a look at specifically in these coming years. And we can definitely not allow ourselves to waste our energies that leads us away from what we have agreed upon at the UN level. We have to fight confrontation, polarization, and hegemony of the two regions really uses up a lot of the energy, a lot of forces, and doesn't allow us. Second thesis, the economies between the US and the EU are much more interconnected than the rhetoric of the Trump era would suggest. And the same is true for the links between the economies of those three regions, so China, US, or China, EU. The trade with China is worth 1 billion euros per day. The trade between the EU and the US comprises 30% of world trade. And if we take a look at the digital trade alone, we speak about 32 billion US dollars that are exchanged in the service area of the digital technologies and internet technologies. And if we count also the sectors that are around adjacent, then it is a total of $125 billion. So at almost $125 billion, the exports of the US have reached again the level of 2017. And I have chosen 2017 because it was the year when Trump launched his trade war with China. So we need to shake off this rhetoric. We have to confront this destruction of the relationship network. And neither China nor Germany are, or the EU are the enemy of the US. Also, Germany, think of the sanctions on steel, for example. Third hypothesis, the development of the Chinese economy since Deng Xiaoping is a shared history of China, the US, the EU, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. And China's leap into the league of leading industrialized nations was achieved by making deals with American and European corporations, which initially responded to the offer of very cheap, highly disciplined labor, while also transferring technology. Taiwanese corporations like Foxconn served as intermediaries between the worlds and very often also as organizers of the exploitative designed mass production. China opted for the growth strategy of inclusive growth and ordered double-digit annual wage growth rates. The corporations and their suppliers went along with it. More technology and more companies migrated from more and more countries. And Workbench of the World that it had been for 25 years, or at least since when China was member of the WTO, enabled low prices that allowed more and more families in the US and Europe to afford computers and flat screen TVs. So this mass production has also led to redistribution of production between the three regions. But this also led to China lifting 800 million people out of poverty. Today, it has grown a middle class of more than 400 million people. And of course, a big discussion about how the economic development of China will go on. And as the chief of the EU trade office in China just said, it is the most important market for the future. Some neighboring countries, Asian countries, successfully jumped on the dynamic development, perhaps most notably South Korea, where the Samsung Group, which produces in symbiosis with China, accounts for 25% of the gross national product. But we have to see also that with the pandemic, many things have changed, but the logic behind this economic program remained the same. And at the same time, we have a reorientation of the product also in the Asian region. China is not anymore the cheap producer. Other countries have taken over production sites where labor is even cheaper, like Vietnam or India. Of course, we can continue country by country and look for the hard comparative advantages in trade. And this leads me to my fourth hypothesis. Eye level brings the potential for conflict. The next stage of Chinese economic development has been reached. We are in a situation where the country's workers no longer produce mainly for export, but products are sold nicely in the own country because the quality is in a way that it improves the demand on the Chinese market. Many products are also becoming competitive internationally. Huawei phones are a prime example of this, but also of the backlash from competitors. And under pressure from the US, Huawei shall be excluded worldwide from the market as much as possible during the switch to 5G in other regions of the world that also has to deal with aspects of security, but it also has to deal with the question, how do we reorganize the economy in a digital way? But it is also about defending oneself, containment of the competitors. And I think that this won't work. This is what the British tried with Germany in the 19th century when they legislated that products imported from Germany had to be labeled made in Germany. So I'd like to thank London. And the practice made in Europe, which is applied today, is another approach to get across, to get beyond this approach. So what does it mean, made in China, made in EU, made in Brazil? China nowadays registers more patents per year than the EU and the US together. In important new technology areas such as artificial intelligence, the country is on par with the US and even ahead of the EU. That is why I believe that in a globalized world, any attempt to contain this development is absurd. We are in front of the need to develop competition where it is necessary and to set the same rules, the same standards, so that we can live up to the social needs. So will we manage for the first time in history to have a hegemon accept the arrival of a major challenger and agree to reorder and reshape the world without going to war? I was discussing this with Walden Bellow the other day, and he argued that the question is not if there will be an armed conflict between the US and China, but when. Henry Kissinger recently warned that the world does not yet have experience of two powers wrestling with each other, both of which have control over the possibilities of today's advanced technology. This is something that we can't that we cannot just simply take care of in this conflict, especially when we think that the world the last conflict between superpowers was fought in proxy wars in other parts of the world. We know that a lot of money is made from war and conflict, and even from the fear of conflict. So when it comes to conflict in the 21st century, we have huge consequences, and that will not allow us to fight climate change at the same time. So let us therefore not be drawn into the conflict by the siren calls from the military-industrial complex. There is a war, economic and military war going on. And the outlook is that we must jointly compensate for and regulate the arrival of new technologies. I do not want to be spied on and manipulated by states or corporations. We must jointly define standards, technical standards, but also standards in international dealings with each other. In doing so, we can build upon the key of the many good agreements that have already been reached within the framework of the United Nations in the last decades. And we have to think about the reform of the World Trade Organization, and we have to make sure that the WTO opens up to questions regarding human rights and environment, for example. And this will allow us to develop a system of rules that includes social and environmental change. This includes building decentralized forms of production on the planet for essential goods. So work and dignity, respect for human rights, including in production, and protection of the environment must become binding requirements for companies that operate in the international production and value chains of our time. For every management, due diligence for its own supply chains, what is called the binding due diligence, must become a basis for its own actions. And this will then also lead to fair trade, fairness, becoming standard in our trade relations. I'm very curious to see whether the new worker-centered trade policy formulated by Catherine Tai for the Biden-Harris administration offers a good approach for us to develop together. We should also take a leaf out of China's inclusive growth benchmarks. Europe can contribute positive experiences with its social security system. And I have come to an end. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing. I didn't even need to say it. It was like he was reading my mind there. Great. Thanks very much for that, Helmut. There's a lot to unpack there, but because we are a little bit over time, which is only to be expected. I will just say very briefly that a couple of big takeaways for me from what Helmut has said are that when the richest and the most powerful countries of the world posit themselves as enemies, it is everybody else in the world who loses. And so we are looking now at a reordering of the world order. This is happening. This is a fact. And it is the responsibility of the left to be very, very concrete about areas of possible collaboration between the EU, the US, China. We should make these proposals and engage this debate as opposed to just ceding the subject of geopolitical relations to the center and to the right. And I have enormous respect for Walden Bello, but I very much hope that he is wrong, that it is not just a matter of if, but when there will be an armed conflict between the US and China. On that note, let's turn to our last speaker, Tobita Chow, or Toby, who's the director of Justice is Global, a project of People's Action, whose mission is to build a grassroots movement to win structural reforms to make the global economy equitable and sustainable. I've gotten to know Toby mostly for the work he's done with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung's New York office, including an excellent recent piece on progressive internationalist strategy under the Biden administration, in which he, similar to Helmut in a lot of ways, describes the US-China relationship as the single most important factor deciding which path humanity will take right now. So on that note, I will just cede the floor to Toby to pick right up, I think, where Helmut left off, as well as perhaps to speak a bit on environment, global Green New Deal, and any other issue that you wish to touch on. Toby, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, that is a very good segue. Overall, I think what we're seeing in the US around China is that both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are embracing an approach of zero-sum competition between the US and China, an approach of turning China into a scapegoat for a wide range of problems within US society, and an approach of containment towards China. And I think, like others have said before, this is dangerous, it's unnecessary. There's a lot to criticize about the Chinese government and the behavior of Chinese businesses, and particularly human rights abuses. But the approach that we're seeing solidifying in the US of zero-sum competition and scapegoating is not going to lead to any progress on any of these issues. So there's a role for progressives in the US and in Europe to clearly separate legitimate criticisms of China from this very dangerous problem of zero-sum competition, scapegoating, and containment. And I think overall that this US-China conflict is being driven by some of the very worst elite interests in both the US and in China. It's been driven by militarists, by nationalists, by certain corporate interests, although corporations in the US are currently very split on the question of China. This anti-China politics is beneficial to certain corporations, and they're really feeding into it. And these elements in both countries are feeding off of each other. So we see anti-China nationalists in the United States strengthen the political power of nationalists in China, and vice versa. So nationalists in both countries are, I like to think of them as not really opposed to each other, but as engaged in a dance where they feed each other's power, and all the rest of us are threatened by it. So then this escalating nationalistic conflict between the US and China is a threat to the well-being of the vast majority of people in both countries and around the world. In introductory remarks, Martin mentioned that we're in a crisis of democracy. I want to mention there's an important connection here. On the right in the United States, we're seeing the emergence of a form of politics that we can call anti-China populism. It's a kind of right-wing populism built on anti-China politics. This has become now a key part of authoritarian politics and the threats to democracy here in the United States from the right. And the escalating US-China tensions are just making that strain of that completely toxic strain of US politics much worse. But I mainly want to focus on how the escalating conflict between the US and China is a threat to global climate justice. I think we can all agree that we need much deeper international cooperation to build a green global economy, shrink the fossil fuel economy worldwide as rapidly as possible. All countries need to work together on this, and cooperation between the US and China is particularly important. So I want to just give an example of how US-China cooperation is at stake. So the US government leads a number of multilateral development banks that fund projects in various regions of the world, particularly in the global south. And in the past, China has helped to establish funds that were managed by these US-led development banks. And because these funds were managed by this US-led institution, that meant that social and environmental standards that were set by the US government applied to those Chinese funds. And also firms in the United States and elsewhere could compete for the contracts that were funded by this Chinese funding. And this kind of triangular cooperation can lead to win-win-win scenarios. So China wins, the US wins, and the recipient countries win. And we know that China has been willing to go further to put up more capital specifically for climate projects. And that China has been willing to put up not just capital, but also technology and manufacturing know-how that comes from China's world-leading clean energy industries, and to work with US-led institutions to share this with other countries in the global south. But that kind of triangular cooperation is now under threat. There is right now an anti-China bill in the US Senate. It's huge. It's 1,500 pages long. It's called the Innovation and Competition Act. This bill, among other things, increases funding for something called the Inter-American Development Bank, or IDB. The IDB is one of these US-led development banks. It funds projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. The IDB is one of the institutions that China has worked with and helped to fund in the past. But now this anti-China Senate bill would impose a condition on all future IDB loans that any country, any Latin American country that accepts an IDB loan must commit to never take out any loan with China. So it turns the IDB into an anti-China tool, a way of trying to push China out of Latin America. It's forcing Latin American countries to, if this bill passes, it will force Latin American countries to choose, do I do business with the US or do I do business with China? It kills the prospects of cooperation between the US and China to provide climate financing and technological assistance in the region, which again, we know China is interested in doing this, and we know that countries in the region would welcome this as well. So this is one concrete example of how US-China cooperation is being undermined. It's an example of how other countries, particularly in the global south, are getting squeezed in the middle of this conflict. And this emerging logic within US politics of you're either with us or against us. I think we're starting to see some similar pressures on in Europe as well. Unfortunately, we can predict it will get worse. And there's a role now for progressives in the US and in Europe to repudiate this approach that the US is taking towards China and emphasize the need for cooperation between the US, between China, and internationally between the whole world, and particularly when it comes to the climate crisis. One other point on what needs to happen around global climate justice is we need changes to global rules. We need changes to the rules of the neoliberal global economy, which have been upheld by the Bretton Woods Institution, by free trade agreements, and so on. And here again, the US-China conflict is a problem. Key changes to global rules that we need include, first, a weakening of intellectual property rights on clean technology. The problem that we're seeing right now with intellectual property rights on COVID vaccines and other medicines has a very close analogy when it comes to climate change. Global South countries currently find it more expensive to access clean technology and often find it impossible to build their own clean energy industries because of the monopolies granted by the intellectual property rights regime. And the beneficiaries here are mainly capitalists in the US, in Europe, other global north countries, although increasingly in China as well, as research takes off in China. Second major rule change, we need to create more policy space for all countries to engage in industrial policy, in green industrial policy, in state intervention into the economy to support a transition to a clean energy economy and dial down fossil fuel infrastructure. And neoliberal global rules have attacked this use of industrial policy as, quote, unfair trade practices. And again, this has been particularly a problem in the global south. So these are two big changes we need to global rules around industrial policy and intellectual property rights. Now we compare this to two key economic grievances that the US has made against China. The US, and this is politicians in both parties, complain that China has been infringing on the intellectual property rights of US corporations. And they complain that China's use of industrial policy is an unfair trade practice. Now, we have to note that these two practices on the part of China have been highly successful and are key to how China has uniquely managed to lift itself out of poverty to become a leading world economy under the conditions of neoliberal globalization. It's also how China has become now a world leader in a wide variety of clean energy industries, which has been an enormous boost in the global fight against climate change. So the last thing that US should be doing is attacking these important features with a lot of progressive implications of the Chinese economy. It's damaging to the Chinese economy. It's also damaging to the prospects of global climate action and the changes to global rules that we need. It's ironic, incidentally, that the US government continues to attack industrial policy in China, even as we are now embracing industrial policy here at home. It's become standard in both parties to say that we need industrial policy to fix the problems in the US economy and compete with China. And this, of course, contradicts this accusation that China's use of industrial policy is, quote unquote, unfair. No one seems to notice this is just one example of just these bizarre, distorted ways of thinking that we are seeing as this US-China conflict escalates. We need progressives in the US, in Europe, and everywhere else to fight back against these distortions. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Toby. Really sort of ending things where we started today and talking about this crisis of democracy. And, I have heard a bit about the anti-China bill in the US Senate, but it's really, I think, a very important and scary thing in the way that the IDB, for example, to give the one example, could be turned into an anti-China tool where we are witnessing multilateralism in reverse, the institutionalizing and hardening of the US-China relations into a conflict with global South countries, as Toby said, getting squeezed in the middle. I think in terms of looking at the possibilities for the left in Europe to intercede in the EU and its recommendations, we had some pretty clear proposals coming from Toby in terms of shifts in industrial policy, green industrial policy, and how it can be accessed in the global South, as well as a weakening of intellectual property rights on clean technologies. And I wonder here if the weakening of IP around COVID vaccines could serve simultaneously for the thing in and of itself, as well as a tactic toward a sort of Trojan horse for the left to weaken intellectual property laws elsewhere, including on clean technology, with von der Leyen and others giving such lip service to the need for a green deal. So we are, of course, we're over time. And I had a bunch of questions for our 5 speakers. I'm going to reduce it down to 2 and ask our speakers to really sort of pick up wherever you want. We don't have to go in the same order. I would like to sort of mix things up a little bit amongst you. If you can keep your interventions to just sort of 2 to 3 minutes at the very most, so that we can have a little bit of flow amongst the speakers. And I would ask our listeners for now, if your question is a question that can be asked in the chat, it would be fantastic if you could put it there and we can try to get to it. If it's not, we'll see if we can get to you, but we are over time, and I've been told that we have to stop a little bit early for our interpreters ahead of the second session. So the two questions quickly for our 5 speakers are this. The first one, which I've already alluded to, is do you have reactions to any of your fellow speakers' comments, disagreements, or things that you would like to build on? And the second question, which I will say as directly as I can, is how can US and European lefts cooperate right now during this next period? What are our priority issues? What are tactical openings? And what are concrete campaigns or events on the near to middle horizon that would be strengthened through transatlantic alliance? We've heard a number of them, but I really want to push all of you. We should have concrete ideas coming out of this gathering today. So on that note, I open the floor to our 5 speakers. I don't know which of you would like to hop in. I think it's really whoever would like to do so. Take the floor. You can, any of you. Any of our 5 speakers, from Toby to Helmut to Medea to Marissa, back to Mark. Things that you want to build on from other presentations. And I see Toby there. Let's just let that, this is the way to do it. We don't have a lot of time left. Jump right in, and the next person be ready to jump right in after Toby. Toby?
All right. I think my pitch for one place to start on collaboration between progressives in the US and Europe is that point that you mentioned on the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines and other medications. I think, like you mentioned, Ethan, it can function as a sort of a Trojan horse for further reforms to the intellectual property rights regime. Although it's not a very good Trojan horse, the corporate interests know that it can act as a precedent for further reforms. But I think that would be a great place to start. It both is going to help us end the pandemic globally. It does get us at these further interests, issues that are very important to global climate justice and other issues. And it also can help to undermine the case for the US-China conflict, because again, intellectual property rights is so central to the arguments there among US hawks. And if there's my project Justice is Global has been active in that campaign here in the US. And I wonder if there's any way that we can sort of support efforts on either side of the Atlantic. I think that's a great place to start.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Toby. Yeah, let's build on that. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that point. You can also switch topics if you wish. Helmut?
Yeah, not looking into the gender balance now, so I leave the other topics to our other panelists. I would agree very much with just now that we should pick up this waiver struggle because it is very important. The patent waiver on according to the COVID-19 vaccination, I think it's just one of the burning issue, and a lot of citizens all over the globe will, of course, look what is done by the patent holders from the United States, European Union, other countries to develop a strategy and a concrete struggle for accompanying their wish and their legally founded, fully founded, legally striving for getting vaccination, and maybe even more also for other medicaments for treatment of ill people. So they put into the WTO initiative by the European Union Commission to open a permanent commission on trade and health should be an example where we need a new narrative for the international rule-based cooperation. And from that, I think the left from both sides of the Atlantic should contribute to raise awareness about this huge problem, this huge challenge. And if we would manage this first small step, I think would be a decisive step where the left can say and show, yes, we are able to move things, that we are able to change the reality in the way citizens are expecting. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I just, because we're short on time, I want to welcome everybody in the chat. Go to a chat and then event participants to share information that you have, to share contacts. I'm going to share my contact and we'll be happy to put any of our members of European Parliament in touch with folks on the US side or vice versa, or whatever combination of those things. I've got see two hands up right now, Mark and Lambus, who's one of the event organizers. Let's hop in with Mark, and I want to make sure that we have time for our other speakers as well, both Medea and Marissa, before we're over. Mark, floor is yours.
Yes, I want to second, of course, the intellectual property problem, and especially on vaccines. And, you know, my co-founder and co-director, Dean Begg's been working on this for over 25 years. And I think we can make some progress, but it's also very vital in terms of just saving lives in the world. And I think the other thing that I want to get to is what Medea mentioned about Yemen. This is an example where it took like 5 or 6 years, but the U.S. Congress, both houses of Congress, finally voted for the first time ever to tell the president to get out of Yemen, to stop the logistical support, the mid-air refueling, and the intelligence sharing. And they passed that. And then, of course, Trump ignored it. But Biden has said he won't, and he hasn't really done much yet. So this is the kind of thing where I think Europe can weigh in and make a difference. And the last thing I'll say is that on the question of democracy that has been brought up several times, the U.S. is in a transitional moment because you know we've won temporarily. We won the battles over the two most important policies that determine people's living standards in the United States, which is fiscal and monetary policy. And if we can hold that, we can make the structural changes that we need here in order to make this a democracy, because it isn't. I mean, if you look at the Electoral College, the Senate, the voter suppression, the gerrymandering, and the Supreme Court, we don't really have an actual, we have minority rule, basically. Structurally, it's kind of like South Africa under apartheid. And I don't mean just the racial aspect, I mean the structure of it in terms of, you know, how a party can rule the country without getting a majority of voters. And that has to change here. And again, any help from Europe in terms of even noticing these things would be helpful, I think.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. We're going to get Lambus. We're going to get to you in just 1 second. I want to see if Medea, if you have just a direct response on this question of Yemen. It's a second very concrete area of collaboration, or anything else that you want to add. But that just does, since Mark sort of called your name out there, it'd be great to hear from you on that.
Yes, certainly it would be great. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, it would be great to it would be great to work together on stopping weapons sales, because we all do it in our own countries, but we would be much more powerful if we did it together. And then I want to also, you said something that you reacted to of other people. I thought when Tobita talked about the patents around green technology being an obstacle to the global South, that's a really interesting point. And yes, I agree, Ethan, that the patent waiver on COVID could be this Trojan horse of the left to move us to challenge these other important patents that are obstacles to progress. And lastly, I want to say that all of this is so connected to the issue of militarism and where we put our money, and that there is so much more we could be doing to oppose NATO. There's an upcoming meeting very soon, and we're not organized enough for that, but maybe on the heels of it, to be putting in the context of the resources that are needed globally to combat the COVID itself and the economic recession as a result of that. And so much of that should be coming from military budgets. So really to denounce this 2% of GDP goals as a joint left of Europe and the US would be great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Lambic? Hello, Lambis. I'm sorry. You'd had your hand up. If you want to hop in here.
Thanks to all of you for the excellent discussion, and many thanks for the participation.
Okay, we weren't hearing you well there, but I did hear you thanking us for the discussion and thanking all of the participants. Was there anything else that you wanted to say, Lambis? Okay, I'll take that as a no. And I will just say also that I have been notified over WhatsApp that Marissa cedes her remaining time. She says that most of what she would have wished to say, others have said. And as a good special rapporteur, she is busy taking notes and writing all of this down. Yes, Lambis, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hear me now?
Yes. Lambis, we can't hear you. We unfortunately, we're almost out of time. If you can resolve your tech problem in the next 1 minute, then we'd love to hear from you. And if not, we're going to have to move on. So again, I think that I've also been told that Marissa has left her email in the chat, would very much like to hear from any of you to stay in touch. I have left my email in the chat as well, and would be happy to put anybody in touch or make any connections. And beyond that, we have just 10 minutes until our next panel begins. I've been asked to carve out this time for our interpreters, whom I would like to take the opportunity to thank and appreciate. It is a very important and tireless and oftentimes sort of underappreciated role, but this sort of thing would not be possible without your work. I really, really appreciate what it is you're doing, and do want to get you that 10-minute break so that you can stretch your legs and have a glass of water or step away from the computer. I will close just by thanking all of our panelists. As per usual, there were many good things said and not enough time to follow up on all of them. I know that you're all familiar with panels where you come away from it wishing that the conversation could continue. But again, I just want to really, really thank Mark Weisbrot from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Please check out their work. Likewise with all of our folks, Marissa Matias, member of European Parliament from the Bloco de Izquierda, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, amongst other organizations where she does really great work on human rights and ending war and militarism. And of course, Helmut Schultz, member of European Parliament, the left's coordinator in the Committee on International Trade. And last but not least, Toby Chow, our director of Justices Global. Please let me know if you want to reach out to any of them or be in touch yourselves. Check out their work. And let's try to build on some of these concrete areas of collaboration, be it Yemen or the waiver, and several others that have been mentioned. Let's please not let this be a conversation that just sort of stays in this room, but actually is the start of us getting to work with one another, because there is a lot of work to do. So on that note, thanks to everybody. Thanks also to our tech people, our other behind the scenes folks, to all of you who are watching on Interactio, as well as on other platforms. And we will see you in just about 8 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes, maybe we'll be a couple minutes late for our next panel of this 2-panel session. Thanks everybody, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Take care.
Can you hear me and see me well? Good afternoon. Thank you. Pilar, ¿te puedo mandar una cosa?
Hi, can you hear me? All right, are we all set? Perfect, okay.
Olivier? Yes, I'm saying who is going to give me the signal to start? At 30 pill, all right. And listen to me. I'm not sure I can use use the console because every time I'm clicking on the console, I'm having a problem. What I'm going to do? Just after just waiting for the other to take the floor, right? Just like that. On the when he speaks, right? Okay. So we don't need to because otherwise it's getting complicated, no? Okay. And so no, in order not to speak, I just have to push the button from when I have to speak, and I need to for the to click the speak button, right? And the camera. Okay. And so everybody, how can I see if all the participants are connected right now? Okay. So with you, me, all right. Okay, so I'm gonna start in 1 minute, just to. Okay. Thank you.
Bonjour, c'est Pierre à Bruxelles. Super.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Bonjour. So,
and I'm in Brussels too. Hello to everyone. I'm Steve Erlanger. Enchanté.
Enchanté. Good afternoon, Mr. Erlanger.
Nice to see you. Happy to help.
Nice to see you too. I'm the coordinator of this event.
Yes, I understand.
Yes. I was a correspondent in Moscow, actually, because I'm a journalist.
Yes. For whom?
It was from 89 to 93.
Well, then we overlapped a bit.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. I remember some of your correspondences I was reading.
All right.
At the time, it was more difficult to read the foreign press.
But wasn't it a fascinating period? My God.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
Were you working for a Greek paper?
Yes, I was working for Tovima, which
exactly.
the major. Yes, I was correspondent.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah,
of course. No, I mean, I tried to be optimistic then.
It's a long story. We have to rethink everything what happened there.
I know. Well, you see behind me, I have my KGB hat is there as a reminder to me. It's true.
All right. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, we can now start the second part, the second panel of this event, in which we will very much like to start constructing new bridges between the progressive forces in Europe and the United States. And I would like to now to present you the panelists. This is Representative Ilhan Omar. She's a congresswoman from the United States and vice president of the Progressive Caucus. Two members of the European Parliament, colleagues, Mr. Pierre Larotte from the Socialists and Democrats, Mr. Ernest Urtasun, a friend and an MEP for the Greens from Spain, and the pleasure to have also Mr. Stephen Erlanger, who is the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, as well. He got the Pulitzer Prize in 2017, and it's a pleasure to have him also. And of course, I would like to give now the floor to our to our co-chair of the group of the left, Mrs. Manon Aubry. Manon, good afternoon to you as well, and of course you can start. You will have, and you have at about 10 minutes each, and then so we will have the time to exchange views, having more people speaking and also answering probable questions. So Manon, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Thaddeus, and hello everyone. I'm very glad to be able to introduce that session that has been organized between the two sides of the Atlantic, actually, and I think it's a great time actually to have this exchange, because both here in the European Union, but also on the other side of the Atlantic in the US, we are facing similar challenges. So it's important for us to build bridges, because those challenges will keep facing them together in the coming months and years. And I'm very glad and very happy on behalf of the left group that I co-chair here in the European Parliament to be able to welcome, at least virtually, and I hope one day in person, our comrades from the other side of the Atlantic. And I'm very happy as well to have friends with whom we work, both Ernest and Pierre Larotte here from the European Parliament. Introducing that session, focusing on the challenging post-pandemic, and in particular tackling poverty in these very unprecedented times that are very unknown for most of us. And as I said, it brings a lot of new challenges. We're probably seeing only now the very first effect of that crisis. So it's been a sanitary crisis for the last few months, but it's turning into an economic and social crisis. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we need to learn. One of them, obviously, is the role of the public sector and the role of the welfare state. Clearly, of course, it's been a dramatic pandemic, but it could have been even much worse without public hospitals and a public system. And we've seen also differences between countries depending on whether it's expensive or not to go to the hospital, etc. So it has clearly underlined the role that our public sector is playing, but also the role of the public sector more generally to support our economy. And it's incredible that after more than a year of that crisis, we're still living living into the hands of the private sector and into the market the way out of that crisis, and looking at vaccines and the monopoly of the big pharma, but looking as well, how enabled we were here in the European Union to just produce our own mask, and we were depending on China. So it has showed the limits of our current system, and clearly without the support of the states and the public sector, our economy would have even more collapse, and we would feel the consequences even more now. That being said, we've seen also that for sure states have been supporting our economy and our companies, but on the other hand, they haven't been asking systematic counterparts to the billions of euros and dollars that they've been introducing into the economy. So it seems like we're keeping on the same economic system, keeping on the same unfair system, keeping on companies polluting, keeping on companies receiving state money, but at the same time that are destroying some of the key jobs into those companies. So those are some of the lessons that I think we should learn from the crisis. And hopefully we are going to get out of most of the health and its sanitary crisis for now. But as I said, we're dealing with social crisis now and probably for the next months and years. And we've seen that poverty has skyrocketed as a consequence of the crisis everywhere. And clearly, it feels like it was not the crisis the same way for everyone. When, for example, in France, we are reaching more than 10 million of poor people under the poverty line. And at the same time, you have the billionaires that have increased their money from more than 50% over the last year. You have companies already giving out some dividends to their shareholders. So clearly, it feels like we were not equal in front of this crisis. Stock markets now are getting higher probably than ever, and inequalities are reaching unprecedented levels. But in the meantime, conservatives want working class to pay for the crisis. So we have the same challenges both in the US and in the European Union. How do we do to avoid those working class paying the high price of that crisis? And we already see from the European Commission and from a lot of member states, asking for a lot of sacrifices from our population. And looking at the different answers that both the US on one hand and the European Union on the other hand have given, I think kind of teaches a lot of lessons. On one hand, we have a massive recovery plan in the US. I'm sure Ilan O'Meara will talk much more about it, which is for sure way bigger than the European one, which includes social safety nets, but also money for the middle class, public services, infrastructure, investment. But also there is a funding part of it with, I wouldn't say a fair yet, just a tax system, but at least a fairer tax system that is introduced. And if you compare it with the EU plan, it seems very small, very regressive, focusing mostly on big corporation and basically coming with austerity counterparts. So it feels a little bit like the European Union at the moment is a very, very small kit compared to what the US is doing. And I do believe that Biden's significant move towards a progressive agenda that has been forced by the left wing of the Democrats is a game changer for us. And we can build on that experience to show how weak the EU response to the crisis is. Now, moving forward, after we compare a little bit the US and the EU, well, there are, I think, two main challenges ahead of us where the public sector and public infrastructure can play a key role. There's obviously reducing inequalities and towards a fairer tax system, and also tackling the probably the most important crisis of the 21st century, which is the climate change crisis. And for that, similarly, we need an ambitious Green New Deal. And similarly, we can be inspired of what the left side of the Democrat has been doing in the US. And we can see that the European Union has tried to copy-paste the title, because we have a Green Deal in the EU, but for some reasons it's not a Green New Deal, probably because it's still using old recipes with those old free trade agreements, investments into fossil fuels, agro-industrial, agricultural policy, etc., etc. And those challenges, if we don't change radically the direction of our policies into the European Union, clearly we will fail addressing both the social and climate crisis. And I think, and this is why we're working together on a Green New Deal proposal, and also a Green New Deal alliance together with Ilan Omar that will be launched in a couple of weeks, which objective is just to say, the end of the month and the end of the world is the same challenge, is the same problem that we need to tackle, and our climate transition has to be fair and has to be equal. Now, concluding on this introduction, and very happy to build bridges between the US and the EU. The key question is, how can we keep learning from each other and strengthen international alliances between the left parties globally? Because as I was saying, part of the plan, the Biden plan in the US, has clearly been pushed by the left side of the Democrats, with Bernie Sanders, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with Ilhan Omar, that we're very happy to have with us today. And we know that they play an important role, and we need to keep working together to share a common agenda, both in the US and in the EU, because we'll need them to move in the same direction to tackle both the climate and the social crisis. We've seen that global alliance also can make a difference. We're seeing this now with the fight for the TRIPS waiver on vaccines patents. We've seen that when Biden had to change his mind, well, thanks to you probably, Ilan, and others, the European Parliament also has to change its mind, and we've been doing this fight for more than a year now, and it's moving in the right direction in the European Union. And we need to develop those global fights further. There are other international initiatives against Amazon and Bezos, against Uber, against corporate impunity, for tax justice as well. And surely when you in the US are fighting, it helps us, and I believe vice versa. We're also learning from each other, I believe, in terms of methods, because we try to do politics a little bit differently, that is directed towards our constituencies with different political methods that I'm sure are a sort of a game changer as well in the way politics has been done for the last decades. And I've been, for example, personally inspired by the squads that we have reproduced in France with my political party. And it means something in terms of sorority, of diversity, but also ways to engage with people, connect grassroots and ideological movements. And, Bernie Sanders' campaign, which was not far from winning, I believe, gave us a lot of hope. And we need those moments, I hope, in France and in a lot of other EU countries. And that's the role of the left group here in the European Parliament, to build those bridges. And I'm very enthusiastic to hear from your perspective from the other side of the Atlantic, and how we can rebuild after the crisis, and how can we work better in the future to tackle those two important crises that I was talking about. Now, passing on back to you, Stelios, and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Thanks, Manon. Thanks a lot. And now, now it's time for Mrs. Omar. Mrs. Omar, as you probably noticed, we are very positively surprised by the first steps of the new Biden's administration. And as you probably know, there is a kind of Biden mania in Europe. So we would like to have, we're looking forward to have actually your ideas about that, and of course how we could coordinate our efforts for common policies in the both sides of the Atlantic. You have the floor, Ms. Omar. Hello, hi.
It's been over a year using virtual methods, and we're still struggling. So I wanted to thank you all for the invitation to meet today. I think we can all agree that with the rise of very coordinated global right wing, it is critical for us to be gathering and forming a united internationalist front on the global left. Meetings like these are crucial to building these alliances, so I'm honored to be here with you all today. I want to speak on some of the challenges that I think that we are collectively all facing. To begin with, the economic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic are going to be enormous, and they're going to hit particularly hard in the global south. I know some of my fellow panelists joined the letter that we sent with Senator Sanders to the World Bank and the IMF last year, asking for a debt cancellation and special drawing rights. And I think we've made a little progress on that, but we all need to keep pushing and not let our brothers and sisters in Africa, Asia, and Latin America suffer disproportionately the economic impacts of the pandemic. And as my colleague was just alluding to, it goes without saying that the biggest crisis on all of our hands is the pending climate catastrophe. Ron Adri has been an incredible partner already in building a global coalition to push for a global Green New Deal. She understands that coordination on climate needs to be fully global in order to have an impact. And so I look forward to the work that we do together, moving legislation on our own countries that take this threat seriously. And just as importantly, I look forward to all of the other efforts that we are going to be collaborating on that are really creating a crisis both in our country here in the United States and in Europe as well. It has been incredible in so many ways for us progressives to have built a massive movement that has allowed for essentially a very moderate president and his administration to take on a lot of the policies that we have been advocating for, and for us to do little to almost zero work in pushing on those main policies in regards to the economy, in regards to healthcare and infrastructure, and now do the work of trying to get them to go a little farther in particular investments in regards to the amount of dollars that will be invested in these programs. As we deliberate now in regards to legislation to invest on our infrastructure and job creation, it's going to be really important for us to continue to lead and push for sustainable investments in regards to these projects. We have done many, now I think 4 recovery packages, the biggest one being the American Rescue Plan. Most of us understood how important it was for us to go big and bold and create investments that allowed for money to go into the pockets of people so that they are able to sustain themselves during this pandemic and the economic crisis that came from it. But we all understand that the recovery investments that have been made in regards to the pandemic are all a crisis investment. They're not investments that are made in the long term. Many of the programs that were funded, created, including one of my own legislations, which helped to feed 22 million children, are all just a year or two type of investment. And so what we are now looking at with the investments going forward is how to make these investments sustainable for 10 years, for 20 years, so that we can actually see the impacts that they will have on the lives of people. I know that people have Biden mania, but we here in the United States have Europe mania. I think many of us understand that there are programs that have been implemented in European countries that we use as a model for the things that we push for here in the United States. And so it is really important for us to both use each other as inspiration and opportunities to recognize the challenges that arise and collectively come up with ideas to address those challenges. So with that, I send it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Omar. And now our colleague Pierre Larotte. He is a member of the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament in the group. It's very easy to know how socialists are seeing this bridge we're trying to establish with the other side of the Atlantic, and how they perceive the new measures taken by the Biden administration. Pierre, you have the floor, please.
Merci Stelios, merci, bonjour à tous. Très heureux de parler après Manon Aubry, très fier et très heureux de parler après Ilhan Omar, une des 4 membres du squad. Donc je m'appelle Pierre Larotte, je suis député européen élu en France d'un parti qui s'appelle Nouvelle Donne, en référence au New Deal de Roosevelt. Manon a plusieurs fois dit qu'il y avait besoin d'une nouvelle donne, d'un changement radical, et on est complètement d'accord avec Manon. Il y a besoin d'un changement radical. Roosevelt, en 1933, a été capable de redonner du travail à des millions de gens, de redonner de l'espoir à des millions d'hommes, de femmes qui étaient cassés par la crise du capitalisme après la crise de 29, et alors que les dirigeants européens n'étaient pas capables de mettre en place des politiques nouvelles et que l'Europe sombrait vers la barbarie. Donc, et Roosevelt, certains pensaient qu'il était fou, les banquiers disaient que c'était un communiste, mais Roosevelt a sauvé la cohésion sociale, il a sauvé la démocratie, il a sauvé l'essentiel avec des mesures très fortes, avec comme une boussole très claire, la dignité humaine, et ça a marché. Et je crois qu'il faut retrouver l'audace de Roosevelt. Donc Manon Aubry, merci beaucoup à Manon et à tous ceux et celles qui ont organisé ce débat, parce que tu as raison Manon, c'est le bon moment pour poser ces questions. Le virus, on espère aux États-Unis comme en Europe gagner la bataille du virus. Il y a encore beaucoup à faire pour que ce soit le cas au Brésil, en Inde ou ailleurs, en Afrique du Sud. Donc évidemment le combat contre le virus continue, mais c'est le bon moment pour poser des questions. Est-ce que le monde d'après sera un monde plus fraternel, plus durable, plus juste, plus équitable, ou est-ce que le monde d'après sera comme le monde d'avant, mais en pire? En pire parce que les États sont surendettés, en pire parce que les entreprises sont surendettées et vont encore presser les salariés et le reste de la planète. Donc on est vraiment dans ce moment crucial où il faut unir nos forces, unir nos intelligences, unir nos forces pour proposer des solutions concrètes qui parlent au plus grand nombre. Quand Roosevelt parlait, tout le monde comprenait ce qu'il voulait, c'était très simple et très efficace. Et après 40 ans de néolibéralisme, il est temps de remettre d'aplomb ce que ces 40 ans de néolibéralisme ont mis sans dessous. Il a insisté déjà sur la question du climat, je ne vais pas insister, mais vous voyez, ça c'est les feux de forêt en Californie, tous les plus grands feux de forêt depuis un siècle, et l'année 2020, c'est 1/3 des surfaces qui ont brûlé en un siècle. Donc le problème climatique s'aggrave. Beaucoup de gens disent qu'avec le Covid, au moins le CO2 a arrêté d'augmenter, c'est faux. Le CO2 qui vient de nos économies a diminué l'an dernier, mais les feux de forêt en Australie, en Californie, en Sibérie sont tellement importants que l'année 2020 est catastrophique pour l'évolution du CO2 dans l'atmosphère, plus 2,6 ppm, c'est 3 fois plus que dans les années 60 ou 70. Donc il y a évidemment besoin d'agir très fortement sur le climat, sur la question de la santé. Je ne sais plus, je retweet souvent Bernie Sanders ou Robert Reich qui disaient voilà, on a eu les vaccins gratuitement. Est-ce que c'était juste une parenthèse ou est-ce qu'on peut permettre l'accès pour tous et toutes à la santé, qui est un élément fondamental? Et je pense qu'en France, on a profité longtemps d'un système de santé plus équilibré, plus juste, plus ouvert qu'aux États-Unis, mais il est en danger aussi. Et il faut rompre dans ce domaine aussi avec la logique néolibérale qui abîme les hôpitaux, qui abîme la cohésion sociale. Un exemple parmi d'autres, ça m'a frappé en 2006, celle qui était la patronne de tous les hôpitaux publics de Paris, a fait son dernier discours comme patronne des hôpitaux publics devant le MEDEF, devant le patronat, et son discours c'était « il faut faire plus avec moins ». il faut faire mieux avec moins d'argent, accueillir plus de malades, avec moins d'argent, soigner des maladies plus compliquées, avec moins d'argent, soigner des maladies plus longues. Elle scandait, il faut faire plus avec moins d'argent, moins d'argent. Et puis, un mois après, elle donne sa démission, elle prend un mois de vacances et puis elle va être la patronne d'un grand groupe privé de maisons de retraite médicalisées, Corian. Et là, elle ne dit pas qu'il faut faire plus avec moins. Là, elle lève ce document, c'est la levée. Elle va sur les marchés financiers pour lever 100 millions d'euros en expliquant que ça va être très rentable, qu'elle a besoin de plus d'argent, mais qu'elle promet des dividendes, plus de 20% du résultat net de dividendes aux actionnaires. Donc, quand elle était la patronne des hôpitaux publics, il fallait s'adapter avec moins d'argent, mais dès qu'elle est dans le secteur privé, elle explique que c'est normal de lever des centaines de millions d'euros et que ça va être très rentable. C'est juste obscène, c'est juste scandaleux. Donc, il est temps de changer de logique et de côté de l'Atlantique, au nom de la dignité humaine, de dire qu'on a besoin de services publics forts, accessibles à tous. C'est vrai pour l'éducation, c'est vrai pour la santé, c'est vrai pour la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique, c'est vrai pour la police, pour la recherche, pour l'énergie. Et pour tout ça, on a besoin d'argent. On a besoin d'argent. Alors, je suis rapporteur général du budget, je ne l'ai pas dit, je suis député comme Manon Aubry au Parlement européen, je suis membre de la commission des budgets et rapporteur général, c'est à moi que le Parlement a demandé pendant un an d'être celui qui négocie. Et j'ai fait une grève de la faim, c'était un peu nouveau, au mois de novembre, pendant 18 jours, j'ai fait grève de la faim pour dire qu'il était temps de changer de politique fiscale et de taxer la spéculation. Voilà l'évolution des marchés financiers, c'est le Dow Jones. La dernière fois qu'on a eu une crise, on était monté à 14 000 points en 2007, et là on est à 32, 33, 34 000 points. Et nous, parlementaires, députés, on se bat pour qu'il y ait une taxe sur la spéculation, en disant quand chacun de nous fait des courses, même pour manger, tout le monde paye de la TVA, 5,5 en Europe, le taux minimum de TVA c'est 5,5%, même les plus pauvres pour manger doivent payer 5,5% de TVA, mais sur les marchés financiers, le Dow Jones, le CAC 40, c'est 0,0 la TVA, 0,0. Donc on se bat avec plusieurs de mes collègues pour obtenir une taxe sur la spéculation qui pourrait rapporter 60 milliards d'euros. On se bat aussi pour stopper la concurrence fiscale. Vous voyez, quand j'étais petit, l'impôt sur les bénéfices était à 45% en Europe, l'impôt sur les profits des grandes entreprises, 45%, on est tombé à 19%, alors que les bénéfices explosent. Donc il faut là aussi, et Joe Biden, peut-être grâce à quelques-uns de nos amis qui l'ont poussé au courage, Joe Biden a proposé qu'il y ait une négociation pour dire un taux minimum d'impôt sur les bénéfices dans tous les pays. Mais est-ce que ce taux va être à 15% ou est-ce que ce taux va être à 25%? Gabriel Zucman était avant-hier à Bruxelles, il disait ça change tout. C'est d'abord une bonne idée d'avoir un taux minimum, donc il faut vraiment obtenir un taux minimum d'impôt sur les bénéfices des entreprises, mais si c'est à 15%, ça ne rapporterait que 50 milliards pour l'Europe. Par contre, si le taux minimum est à 25%, on aurait en Europe 170 milliards de plus pour les politiques, pour la santé, pour le climat. Et c'est tout à fait faisable, un taux minimum à 25%. Je vous rappelle qu'aux États-Unis, de Roosevelt jusqu'à Trump, l'impôt est à 38%. 35% au niveau fédéral et 3% au niveau local. Donc oui, il faut se battre. La taxe sur les milliardaires, Gabriel Zucman, Piketty, montre que le nombre de milliardaires a triplé en 10 ans. Le nombre de milliardaires a triplé en 10 ans. Ce serait normal de leur proposer un petit effort. Et là aussi, si des deux côtés, je suis vraiment très heureux d'être en dialogue avec des députés, des membres du Congrès américain, si des deux côtés on pousse pour la taxe sur la spéculation, Joe Biden a dit qu'il était d'accord pour taxer la spéculation, mais est-ce que oui ou non on le fait des deux côtés? Est-ce que oui ou non on a un niveau minimum d'impôt sur les bénéfices à 25%? Est-ce qu'on taxe les milliardaires? Ça a du sens. Dernier point, je ne sais pas si j'ai encore un peu de temps de parole, il faut lutter aussi contre la concurrence salariale et le dumping salarial. Cette courbe, c'est pour l'ensemble des 15 pays de l'OCDE, ce qui va au salaire et protection sociale. C'était à peu près 67% du PIB dans tous nos pays il y a 30 ans. Et puis partout, la peur du chômage déséquilibre la négociation. Dans beaucoup d'entreprises, la négociation, c'est si tu n'es pas content, tu peux aller voir ailleurs. Donc partout, la part des salaires diminue, ce qui va aux salariés diminue, et c'est des sommes colossales qui auraient dû aller aux salariés et à la protection sociale et qui vont partir vers les marchés financiers. On avait fait ce calcul avec Michel Rocard, l'ancien Premier ministre français. Au total, c'est 150% du PIB en 30 ans, 150% du PIB en 30 ans qui auraient dû aller aux salariés et aux caisses de sécurité sociale et qui sont partis vers les marchés financiers. Et pour que les gens continuent à consommer, on les a poussés à s'endetter, je finirai là-dessus. La part des salaires diminue partout, mais on pousse les gens à s'endetter. La courbe est impressionnante, c'est la dette totale aux États-Unis depuis 1950. On voit que tant qu'on tenait bon sur un système à peu près social, Philadelphie, des règles sociales dans chaque pays dans le commerce mondial, c'est entre 1945 et l'arrivée de Ronald Reagan, la dette totale, dette privée et publique n'augmentait pas. Il y a eu 30 années sans crise financière, sans crise et sans avoir besoin de dette. Et puis à partir de l'arrivée de Ronald Reagan, on explique que toutes ces solutions collectives pour améliorer les salaires, on les supprime, on précarise le marché du travail, la part des salaires diminue et on pousse les gens à s'endetter. L'argent qu'on ne va pas donner par le salaire, on va dire aux gens, OK, tu n'as pas eu d'augmentation, mais tu peux acheter une voiture, on va te prêter l'argent. Et puis on baisse les impôts sur les plus riches, Ronald Reagan et d'autres baissent les impôts sur les plus riches. Mais on voit bien que la crédibilité économique, elle est de notre côté. C'est tant qu'on tenait bon sur la justice sociale, tant qu'on tenait bon sur Philadelphie avec des règles, le texte de Philadelphie signé par Roosevelt avant Bretton Woods, la première chose que fait Roosevelt, c'est Philadelphie, et qui dit que dans chaque pays et dans le commerce mondial, il faut des règles concrètes, c'est pas du blabla, des règles sur le salaire minimum, sur le temps de travail, sur comment on finance la retraite des vieux. Et tant qu'on tient bon sur la justice sociale, on a 30 années sans crise financière et sans avoir besoin de dette. Et quand les libéraux arrivent, on précarise tout le monde et il faut toujours plus de dettes privées et dettes publiques pour maintenir le système. Donc à coup sûr, même du point de vue de l'abattement de l'économie, c'est nous qui avons les solutions. Le libéralisme nous amène à la catastrophe. Ce système néolibéral fout en l'air la planète, détruit la planète et détruit la cohésion sociale. Il y a 2 mois, on a été reçu par le pape François. J'ai été reçu à Rome par le pape qui voulait soutenir notre campagne pour taxer la spéculation. Et le pape François nous disait qu'un système où l'argent domine tout, où l'argent c'est une idole, il n'a pas dit que c'était de la merde, il a dit que c'est le fumier du diable. Le pape dit que ce système économique où l'argent écrase tout, c'est le fumier du diable. Et le pape nous a dit qu'il fallait qu'on fasse la révolution. Donc je crois que c'est à nous, des 2 côtés de l'Atlantique, joyeusement, de faire la révolution au nom de la dignité humaine.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre. Que Dieu t'écoute. Now Ernest Ortelsohn is the next speaker. He is representing the Greens. He's part of the Greens in the group of the Greens in the European Parliament. And of course, since we have good news and bad news, he's the right person to speak about the climate crisis, because the good news are that Biden announced that the United States are coming back to the international agreement. The bad news is that the climate crisis is worsening from month to month and year to year. And so what can we do together with the American colleagues to tackle the question? Ernest, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Stelios, dear friend. Thank you also to all the colleagues from the group of the left of the European Parliament for inviting me, to Manon, and also it's a really big pleasure to be with Pierre Larotte and with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in that discussion. And thank you for organizing it, because I think that this dialogue between the left in Europe and the US is extremely important. I think that we have many challenges ahead of us, and we need a bit of coordination to try also to make our agendas a bit coordinated in what do we want the EU and the US to work together at the global stage. And I'm going to refer to 4 things, one being, of course, climate change, as Stelios was mentioning. But firstly, I think that we need to reflect upon the kind of economic response also that we are giving to the economic pandemic. You know, we are seeing many of the measures that Biden is taking with a lot of interest from the European side, because the fiscal stimulus in Europe is falling short. Everybody noticed that. So I think it was very important what we achieved in managing to set up a joint borrowing program in order to invest 750 billion euros. But that, of course, compared to the fiscal stimulus in the US, it's extremely short. So I think that this is important, that we can campaign together on that. Also because in Europe we will have a very important debate coming ahead, probably after the German elections, which is the reform of our austerity-driven crazy fiscal rules that have been governing Europe in the last months. And I think really that the agenda of the current US administration, which is at the end a success of the left of the Democratic Party, because I think that Biden is governing with your agenda, or with part of your agenda. I think the winds of change there are going to be extremely important for us in that debate that we will have in the second half of this year in Europe. So here, I think this is really a place where we need to really to cooperate. And also, I think that another element that we need to reflect upon together is the whole economic governance at the international level. I think that we all know that the Bretton Woods system that we built together after the Second World War is broken, that we need something completely new. And this is something as well that the European and the American left need to think together of how to go beyond a governance system which completely falls short. This is one thing, one of the most important agendas I think that we have together. Secondly, of course, as Stelios was mentioning and asking me, is the question of climate change. I would like to also thank everybody in the US who worked so hard to make political change in the US, which could lead to a return of the US to the negotiating table of the Paris Agreement. I think that was so important in order to Paris not to fail. And this is really, really a major breakthrough. But this is not enough, of course. And as you probably know, in November, we have the COP meeting in Glasgow. And currently, the different commitments, both of the EU, of the US, but of several of the biggest polluting economies, are not enough to meet the target of the Climate Paris Agreement of limiting the increase of temperature to 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees maximum. We will go well beyond that. And that, of course, in terms of biodiversity, of human well-being, it's going to be a catastrophe. And that is why I think that we need also to coordinate agendas to put a lot of pressure in having ambitious targets, reduction targets, already for 2030. The EU has committed itself to build a carbon neutral economy in 2050, but we don't have in the new climate law that we are going to vote in the parliament, we do not have yet a clear target for reduction in 2030, which the European Parliament called it to be 60% reduction. And here I think that we also need to work together, the left in the US and Europe, to make Glasgow a success. And in order to make Glasgow a success, we need the US and Biden to work hand in hand in order to really achieve that. And also in that regard, I think there's another element of that debate that Manon touched in her introduction, which is how to secure that the recovery is green. And here I think it would be interesting to hear a bit our colleagues from the US, how do they see the stimulus plans of the Biden administration from a green and ecological transition perspective. Because, well, in the EU, the green recovery, the biggest recovery tool, which is the RRF, is supposed to be green. It has a clear earmark of 37% of the money having to be spent in activities directly fighting climate change. But we have been in the last weeks analyzing the different national plans, and many member states will fall short of that 37%, which means we will be wasting a unique opportunity to push for ecological transition. So I think that the greening of the stimulus plans is a huge agenda also for us. And I think that that is also something also that we need to work together. I would like to touch two additional points. I'll try to be brief. The third agenda point for us for cooperation, I think, is public health. Well, in Europe, we have been suffering in many member states from the austerity inducted after the last financial crisis, which created lots of problems. But still, of course, we have a universal public health system, which you don't have in the US. And here, the push of the left, of the Democrats, to really have a public affordable health for everybody in the US is something that we as well can help in our dialogue in campaigning, and I think this is also an area where we need to cooperate. And finally, my fourth point, and I will end here, is what Pierre said. I think that we need to be very tough on the taxation agenda at the international level. I think that if there has to be a big shift in how do we understand the organization of our societies in the 21st century, I think that taxation needs to be the greatest of the revolutions, I would say. And here again, I think that the first decisions of Biden are very much welcome. I think that when we saw that the raising of the nominal corporate tax to 28%, the proposal of the GILTI to 21%, was very welcomed. And I have to say that we have been very critical on the European side to see that actually that 21% was watered down by the majority of member states, and now we are talking of having only a 15% effective tax rate. which is too low in our opinion. Of course, having a minimum effective tax rate at global level of 50% would be very good, but we need more than that. And of course, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the G7 already at the end of this week, which will be discussing that. But I think that this is really a clear agenda that we have in common. The international minimum tax rate to be something effective, but well above that 50% that they are discussing. Secondly, all the issues related to the digital taxation, to the FTT, as Pierre Larotte was saying, and also of tax transparency, which at the European level we just adopted new legislation on tax transparency, which is good, but falls a bit short. And I know our colleagues in the U.S. Senate are trying to adopt legislation for tax transparency as well. I think that this is also an area where we need to work together and cooperate. So voila, those are 4 points that I wanted to touch on, things that I need that I think we need to work together in the future to have really a strong agenda of the left, both in Europe and the US. And really thank you again for organizing that dialogue, because I think it's extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ernest. And now it's the time for Mr. Stephen to take Stephen Erlanger to take the floor. Stephen, you are rather an observer in this discussion, but I would like to add to have also your opinion. I don't know what exactly you wanted to say, but they say that after a big pandemic crisis, there have always been historical drastic changes. And I don't know if you can, if you could say that we have such a change now, that after 40 years of the Ronald Reagan era, we're going to a new era in which the government is not the problem, as Reagan says, but rather is the solution of spending trillions of public investments coming from Biden, taxation of the big multinationals. Can you see that we are entering a new period, or what do you think? Anyway, you have the floor.
Stelios, thank you very, very much. It's a great privilege to be with you. I am not a member of parliament and have never wanted to be, but I very much believe in what you're doing. I'm glad you're doing it. I've been very impressed by what everyone has had to say. It's a particular privilege to be on the same panel in a way with Congresswoman Omar, who is, I think, an exemplification of some of the change happening in my own country. I don't think the United States is becoming more European, but it is becoming younger and more diverse, and I think more open to the rest of the world. And I think that's very important. Stelios, you raise a very important point, which is, you know, how you judge Joe Biden. I mean, is Joe Biden an intermezzo between two conservative presidents that will be more Trump-like, or is Joe Biden a representative of a new collective future despite his age? And I think that's a very serious question. And it's a question that will partly be answered in not maybe 17 months in the American midterms, right? Because with the Senate 50-50, it's going to be very hard, I think, even if Biden remains very popular, to hold on to the Senate. And if he doesn't have the Senate, then we're going to have an Obama-like situation where for the first 2 years, Obama controlled both houses. The Democrats controlled the government, so a lot got done. The next 6 years, we had divided government, and Obama had much harder time. I mean, you work through executive orders and other things, but it was very hard for him to get legislation that mattered through Congress. So Biden's in a hurry. He needs allies. His interests are domestic because he knows his main task is the recovery. It's to build on the Trump vaccination program and to build on recovery. And that, to me, is the most interesting thing when we think about the title of this panel, which is Strengthening the Public Sector, Reducing Poverty in the Post-Pandemic Era. I think globally too, and I think one of the most interesting things has been in time of crisis that people have gone back to government for protection because government is, has the tools. Now, to me, the most important thing in recovery, the most important thing in helping the poor is vaccines, 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 vaccines. Vaccinate as quickly and as many as possible, do it as cheaply as possible to stop new variants from coming that render vaccines useless. I think it is time for both of us, I mean, the United States and Europe, to start pushing out vaccines into Africa, Asia, other parts of the world, because we've all said this, but it actually is true that, the world has to be vaccinated for everyone to feel safe. So this debate over waivers of intellectual property seem to me at least irrelevant. The main point is to push up production. And if that means governments continue to subsidize private companies who are making these amazing vaccines, well, I think it's a very good use of money. Because if you think even, let's say, an expensive Pfizer dose, let's say it's $26 for 2 doses, when you compare the cost of that to the loss of gross domestic product, the loss of taxes, the loss of jobs suffered by any country, the cost is minimal, absolutely minimal. So I think that is my first point, really. The second interesting thing to me is early in this pandemic, there was a big debate, an economic debate, about whether the US would rebound more quickly than the European Union, or would the European Union rebound more quickly than the United States, because, as you've said, the two social systems are really very different. I mean, Europe has these automatic stabilizers, we call them, that kick in to preserve at least basic income. The Germans had a kind of Kurzarbeit, short work program that kept people in work, at least partial work. Joblessness was much lower in Europe than in America, which suffered very badly. And yet the problem was Europe's effort to freeze the economy by spending lots of money was fine until the second wave came, and then the third wave came, and that's really the problem. So the problem is the flexibility of the economy, because I'm one of these people who, whatever you think about who's governing you, the biggest issue for poverty and alleviation of poverty is economic growth, is job creation, and is a fair system of taxation. And all these things can be improved upon. As we look now at forecasts, US real GDP growth is expected this year to be about 6.6%, which is very high, but of course it comes after this terrible blow that everyone had. And for 2022, it's probably 4.4%, which is really quite high, I think. In Europe, however, which always grows more slowly, is an older population, has issues with migration, all these problems. Growth is expected to be 4.2% this year after recession, real recession because of the pandemic, and only 4.4% in 2022, which is roughly what the American growth rate is. So I think things are looking up if we don't get some new crazy variant. And then comes the question of taxation. I mean, your colleagues were quite correct in praising, I think, and I agree with them, though I'm not supposed to have opinions here, but I agree with them that Biden was quite right to raise corporate tax and to raise taxes on highest earners. And the highest earners starts at a relatively modest level too. But when you think about it, those levels of taxation are significantly lower still than they used to be. So in a sense, I think Biden's being pretty moderate trying to get this through. I would have liked to have seen taxes go up a bit higher. But as ever, the question is, how will the taxes be used, and will they be used well? And what happens to this big monster pile of debt that we're all building up, particularly as inflation begins to take hold? And this is one of the things that worries me the most, because inflation is a really very unfair tax, right? I mean, it taxes the poor worse than it taxes the rich. So these are important issues. The other important issue, which all of you have also mentioned, is how we deal with climate and the Green Deal. And this worries me very much, because no matter all the virtue signaling people have made and the wonderful words that get said, the fact is economic disruption will be very important, be vital, be completely has to happen if you're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, let alone do it quicker. And what worries me is that the poor get protected. I mean, my real worry is that there are a lot of jobs out there that will not come back. Will the retraining happen that we all talk about but never seem to do properly? You know, when you look at the United States, it is very true. I mean, growing up myself in a very middle-class family in Connecticut, you know, real incomes for the middle class in the United States have not just stagnated, they've dropped. The expectations of the middle class are down. And, you know, part of it, you know, we always like to blame on globalization and China and so on. And that's partly true, but partly it's due to automation. We produce in America lots and lots and lots of stuff, but we do it with far fewer people. And yet governments have been very slow in thinking about how to retrain all those people so they can have continually productive, satisfying lives and bring up their children at least as well as they were also brought up. Now, when you look globally and you look at poverty, of course, over the years, poverty is shrinking. It doesn't feel like that, but of course that's true. More people live better. But I think we're now at, you know, what some people call a very important inflection point, which I hope the pandemic will drive us all to do, which is to understand that to be not just safe at home, but to feel that our lives are getting better, we have global responsibilities. That democracies in particular, the EU and US, Biden is right about this, they need to show their people that democracy works. If there is a challenge from autocracy, from authoritarian governments around the world, it is really important that we together work on how to make the Green Deal better, on how to make climate work for everyone, how to deal with unfair trade practices, and how we preserve our own value systems, even at home, and inside the European Union too, in terms of independent press, rule of law, fair judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of work to do at home. I'm encouraged by all of you, and I think we have a serious task ahead of us, but we have to move quickly because the Biden moment may not last forever. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. One colleague of us, Bernardo Barrena, has asked to make an intervention. So, Bernardo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Stelios. My name is Fernando Barrena. I am a member of the European Parliament from the Basque Country at the Left Group. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate the organizers of this great webinar, and particularly Helmut. It's been a great initiative. I would say that there's significant expectation about the new Biden era here in Europe, and not only as regards to the changes on social policies announced by the president himself, but very particularly on foreign policy. The first panelist told us that Biden will not bring any significant change on this issue, but as a big difference to Trump, that he cares about the European political stance. Let me say that I believe that Europe is not willing to play a strong polarity role in the multipolar world power scheme. Europe's foreign policy has been fully subsidiary of the United States global stance, and it doesn't seem that neither the Union's High Representative for External Action nor the European Council or the member states are thinking about an independent European foreign policy beyond the USA stance. Anyway, the ongoing reshaping process of the world order is of paramount importance for the left because it marks the limits of the social justice agenda and the freedom of peoples and the violent conflicts they are involved in different occasions. Palestine, Western Sahara, Colombia, Kurdistan, all of them are conflicts directly affected by the USA and European foreign policies. I like to mention as well the issue of the new arising states in Europe, like Catalonia, the Basque Country, Scotland, Flanders, or the reunification process in Ireland. This also has to be a concern of the left, and it's comforting to assess that most of those democratic processes are led by left-wing or progressive forces. And in that context, I believe that cooperation between the European and North American leftist and progressive forces is more than necessary. The social consequences of the pandemic are asking for a reliable alternative by the left. This is a global task, a big challenge that needs cooperation from both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to you, dear colleague. Now, is there any? I cannot see somebody who wanted to take the floor. Is that correct? Yeah. In that case, oh, there is somebody who wants to speak. Is it true, Olivier? Yes. All right. Okay. Pierre?
Oui, pardon, j'ai déjà beaucoup parlé, mais je voulais appuyer ce qu'avait dit Steven sur la question de comment lutter contre le chômage et la précarité. J'ai montré tout à l'heure la courbe de la part des salaires qui diminue partout. Un économiste très connu chez nous, Thomas Piketty, montrait que la dernière fois que la gauche en France a vu du courage, en 1900, quand Mitterrand est arrivé en 82, la réforme fiscale avait permis de gagner 0,3% aux salariés, 0,3%. Et depuis, à cause de la peur du chômage, la part des salaires a baissé de 10% du PIB. 10% du PIB. Donc Thomas Piketty disait, la peur du chômage est responsable d'un recul des salariés 30 fois plus important que la dernière réforme fiscale que la gauche avait faite. Donc lutter contre le chômage est évidemment très important pour tous les chômeurs et les précaires, mais aussi pour tous les salariés, parce que même celui ou celle qui a un bon job, on est tous tirés vers en bas quand il y a la peur du chômage. Et donc comment lutter contre le chômage ? À mes yeux, il y a deux grandes questions. C'est mettre un grand Green Deal, un vrai plan climat, comme le propose AOC, comme on est nombreux à le proposer des deux côtés de l'Atlantique, avec des vrais financements. Et on peut créer des millions d'emplois, des emplois solides, bien payés, utiles, avec un vrai Green Deal. Et puis, il faut reparler de la question du temps de travail. Et Steven en a parlé, c'est très bien. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait des gains de productivité? Cette courbe, elle est impressionnante. Elle vient d'un travail de Robert Reich qui montre comment l'emploi industriel aux États-Unis, on a perdu 30% des emplois en 30 ans, moins 30%. Mais la production industrielle avait augmenté de 80%. On a presque doublé, malgré la mondialisation très mal régulée, malgré la Chine et d'autres pays qui ne respectent aucune règle sociale, la production sur le territoire américain a quand même presque doublé, plus 80%. Et comment est-ce qu'on explique la différence entre la production qui a presque doublé et le besoin de travail qui a reculé de 30%? C'est les gains de productivité. C'est les robots, c'est les ordinateurs, c'est l'intelligence qu'on a mis dans la tête des gens. Et ça pourrait être une bonne nouvelle, le fait qu'on a besoin de 30% de travail en moins, mais le problème, c'est que la durée réelle du travail pour un homme ou une femme qui travaille dans l'industrie est restée à 40 heures. Et du coup, on a coupé, si on a besoin de 30% de travail en moins, on a coupé 30% des effectifs. Donc il y avait une autre solution, beaucoup plus juste, c'était de baisser le temps de travail. En France, on est en train de relancer, en Espagne, la gauche espagnole, on relancé le débat sur la semaine de 4 jours. La semaine de 4 jours, le gouvernement espagnol vient de décider, à la demande de la gauche, de mettre des dizaines de millions d'euros pour expérimenter la semaine de 4 jours. En France, on a déjà des 400 entreprises qui sont passées à 4 jours sans baisser les salaires. On se rend compte que si on veut créer des emplois, il faut que la réduction du temps de travail soit forte. Si on fait 1 heure de moins ou 2 heures de moins, ça ne crée pas d'emploi et ça ne change pas la vie. Par contre, si tous les salariés passent de 5 jours à 4 jours, de même que Ford était passé de 6 jours à 5, depuis un siècle, on était à 7 jours, on est passé à 6 jours, on est passé à 5 jours. Donc, il faut relancer, je pense, la négociation sur les 4 jours. Et en France, je pourrais vous envoyer des documents, on a 400 entreprises qui sont passées à 4 jours sans baisse de salaire, sans aucune baisse de salaire. L'idée, c'est que quand l'entreprise passe à 4 jours, si elle crée 10% d'emplois, elle arrête de payer les cotisations chômage. Donc, dans tous les secteurs, on a dans les yaourts, dans l'informatique, dans la charpente métallique, dans tous les secteurs, on a des exemples d'entreprises qui sont passées à 4 jours. Et on estime en France que si tout le monde passait à 4 jours, on pourrait créer 1 600 000 emplois, 1 600 000 emplois, et les gens vivraient beaucoup mieux. Et ça permet un accès à la formation, un accès à du temps libre pour la vie personnelle. Donc, je remercie Steven d'avoir reparlé de cette question. Je pense qu'il est crucial. À mes yeux, les 3 grands leviers pour créer des emplois, c'est agir pour le climat, avoir une vraie politique de santé pour les secteurs publics, la santé, la justice, la recherche, et puis relancer la négociation sur la semaine de 4 jours sans baisse de salaire.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui voulait, à ce moment-là, intervenir? Non. Okay. Alors, I'll speak in English. When we first started thinking about this event, it was a time when the Biden administration was not actually governing. Now, working together with the American Democrats is becoming more and more important. Learning from their experience and the experience of the Democrats in power is more important. And I hope the next meeting, we will have for sure the next meeting with Mrs. Omar, Stephen, and all our guests who are in Brussels. And I hope the new meeting will be live. We can share hands and we can talk to each other in person and not through the computers. Thanks a lot for everybody, the panelists, and also the people they followed the event, and à la prochaine. Can I media? I see. Can I see well that media is asking to speak? No. Okay. So Hello to everybody.